Hi, this is a video response to Shawn of the Shawner Films channel. Hi Shawn. He brought out, he produced a video that has to do with a very interesting subject in my opinion. A sort of topic that every now and then is brought about when it comes to the tabletop RPG hobby. And he is basically talking about how science and fantasy or science fiction sometimes is too similar or perhaps it's the same as fantasy. This is similar to the argument that when it's really high tech, when technology is sufficiently elevated, it could be considered magic. And there are some things that I think that I agree with, but I also want to talk about how I still have my own opinion when it comes to how magic and fantasy is handled in role-playing game that merits or deserves its own distinction, its own genre as fantasy. So let's talk about the similarities because Shawn makes some pretty convincing arguments. He basically says that in a fantasy setting, there are some things that are pretty much science. It's basically the science of that setting. So let's say that you are playing your typical fantasy game, Dungeons and Dragons, Tunnels and Trolls. You have pretty much any tool, any equipment, weapons. They are pretty much, they have to do with science and technology. It could be considered a primitive technology depending on how close to the Middle Ages a particular setting is. But anything related to axes, crossbows, you need science to create those tools. Remember that technology is the result of applying science. So if you have this science fiction setting far off into the future, you have your laser weapons and your spacesuits and powered armor and all of that. That's also science in a way. But I think there is a confusion when it comes to magic and science, and how sometimes magic in fantasy role-playing games, it's pretty much science as well, because in Dungeons and Dragons you have these spells. You know that when you are going to cast magic missile, you can predict the result, just like in science in real life. That's the part of the scientific method. You come up with a hypothesis. You think, oh, maybe this happens if I attempt this. You put it to the test. You carry out your experiment, and then you find out if it's actually true or false. So maybe, let's say something really silly, like you think, oh, maybe if I put my hand into the fire, it's going to burn my skin. Let's put it to the test. And you do that, and ow, you burn yourself. And so the experiment is a success. But this can be elevated to even more extraordinary things. Like for example, maybe many of you have already heard about the Wim Hof method, which goes about everything that was taught in school, or sun gazing. So in the case of the Wim Hof method, and if you haven't seen it, I'm going to put a pair of videos in the description, the promotional video and the method itself. And a lot of people don't want you to know about that method because it's free and you can do it at home. And it's an extraordinary method. It's the reason why I only take cold showers all the time, even during winter. I take cold showers and I can always be dressed or just like it's summer. So in the case of the Wim Hof method, they tell you, well, in school, of course, in school, they tell you, no, the cold temperature is going to get you sick. Oh no! And if you start to work on the Wim Hof method, you overcome those extraordinary, extreme temperatures. That's why you are able to, yes, to be submerged in ice cold water. Wim Hof himself has broken many records when it comes to remaining in the ice for 2 hours, and I don't remember the exact time, so you may want to look that up. So that's a way in which you apply science. You think, is it possible to adapt the human body to extraordinary or rather extreme temperatures? because you can also use this when extreme, when it's very hot, so that you do not sorry, you do not pass out from extreme heat, or when this heat stroke. So you put it to a test, you start to work on the Wim Hof method, and suddenly you're dressed in shorts and with a tank top in the middle of winter, perhaps walking in the snow barefoot. So it's all about that, putting things to the test. That's the scientific method. And so if we take that into consideration, almost every spell in many fantasy role-playing games, they are scientific in that fictional context. Fireball, you use this ingredient and you roll your dice to see how much damage you deal. The fireball is always going to work unless there is some sort of anti-magic field or some artifact or some counter spell that negates the spell. So I think Shawn makes a pretty good point when it comes to that, that fantasy games are pretty much a sort of science fiction, and vice versa. Science fiction is also a fantasy, because many technologies that are used in science fiction, they haven't been developed yet. But here is where I think you could say something else that still creates that division between fantasy and science fiction. When it comes to science fiction, for example, Shawn talks about faster than light travel. So, at least when it comes to our current knowledge of science, because science is always, rather, the scientists are always messing up. A few decades ago, I don't know if you remember, they said that the Komodo dragon, you know, that big lizard, it didn't have a poisonous bite, that is, it didn't have glands that produced poison. They said that the bite of the Komodo dragon was poisonous because the creature was eating this like fermented fruit, or they came up with some really idiotic theories. But then they studied Komodo dragons, and it turns out that they actually had glands that produce this deadly toxin. So you should always take science, especially mainstream science, with a big grain of salt, especially in current times where there is so much disinformation. Always carry out your own experiments. I've said this in other videos. You should become a scientist yourself. Start to apply the scientific method. Question everything. Carry out your experiments and find out the truth. So, yes, when it comes to science fiction, the thing that I think that separates science fiction from fantasy is that even though we do not have the science or the technology in those fictional settings or games, you can apply some scientific principles from real life to those settings. And this is not always possible in fantasy. Many species and races, we haven't seen anything similar in real life. In science fiction settings, they always give you a reason as to why that alien or any sort of creature or device is built in that way. There is some sort of reason related to evolution, in the case of technology, to cybernetics, as to why that creature or that device is shaped like that, why it has those functions. But in fantasy, there are some pretty nonsensical things. And depending on the system, for example, Dungeon Crawl Classics, there are some these crazy spells that you cast them and they are unpredictable. And I think that approaches the concept of what you could call real magic, at least when it comes to occult practices, shamanism, and all of that in real life, that what could be considered magic cannot be analyzed. Science should be applied to the material world when it comes to things like, for example, poetry and feelings and really abstract concepts that go beyond the reach of science, which is about analyzing, quantifying all things related to our material world. Yes, you simply cannot apply that to magic, and there are some role-playing games where you cannot predict the results. where the results are completely tied to the whims of some sort of spiritual entity or being. So that's when I think there is a difference between fantasy and science fiction. Especially, for example, some could say, well, maybe those beings, they are like us, but they exist in another dimension. But then you would need to justify to say something that in real life there exists this sort of machine that allows you to travel into another dimension. So unless such things are proven in real life, it is very difficult to apply those principles to fantasy, because if fantasy is not real, it's an exaggeration. In the case of the magical aspects and folklore, because you have goblins and hobgoblins and kobolds. Interesting thing, did you know that the element of the periodic table, cobalt, do you call it in English cobalt? I think you do, right? It's actually derived from kobold, because it turns out that the kobolds in folklore, they tricked miners into obtaining these metals, and when the miners or the people that work with the metal started to smelt the metal, it produced this toxic substance that was quite deadly. So that's why they called it cobalt, because of the kobolds. So, yes, many things related to folklore, occult practices, shamanism, spirituality. We do not have something similar in real life as they are represented in fantasy role-playing games. They could be considered more like a philosophical or cultural thing, and it is up to you to discover if it has some sort of function or pragmatism to it. So yes, Shawn, I actually agree that there are many fantasy games that feel a bit, yes, more like science fiction, and vice versa, science fiction games that feel fantasy. But sometimes, like for example in my review of the Dark Energy role-playing game, my recent review, you have a science fantasy setting. Why is that? Because there are some technological nuances that can be explained through real world science, like the Hadron Collider. But when it comes to, like I said, all of those fantasy species and races, like cyclopses and fairies, and they are exaggerated in that role-playing game. You do not have a reference, a scientific reference in real life to apply it to that fictional representation. So I think it is still important, if not comfortable for us, to have science fiction separated from fantasy. Because that way, when someone talks about fantasy, you know that there's going to be like this powerful magic force, like the weave in the case of the Forgotten Realms, related to Mystra and all of that. And there are going to be like elves and goblins, and when it comes to science fiction, there is always like, oh well, they took those scientific principles and they moved them to the fictional setting. But you can't say, oh well, they took real life kobolds and they observed kobolds and goblins and they applied those to so that's why I think there should still be a distinction. Either way, I really liked the Shawn's video. The link will be in the description below. Definitely check it out. It's pretty good when it comes to food for thought. And yes, I would be interested to know what you consider to be science fiction or fantasy in the comments. If you have some ideas that, oh, well, I think they are all the same, or this applies or this doesn't apply, let me know in the comments section. So thank you for watching this video. Thank you, Shawn, for telling me about your video. And yes, I think that's it for today. And thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending drive-thru RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you and see you later.